what it is that we're trying to accomplish is that, let's say we have a signal, and we would like to model that signal as the impulse response of a rational system function. So you can think of it like in the context of filter design, that's kind of what we talked about, which is, let's say I have a frequency response I want to achieve or approximate, or I have an impulse response. What I want to design is a difference equation that will, in some sense, realize approximately that frequency response or impulse response. So it's not any different, really, than what we talked about in the context of filter design, but it's going to be with different criteria and sometimes for different purposes. So, and I'm going to phrase it mainly in terms of the impulse response of a pole zero system. And I'm going to phrase it mainly, initially at least, in the context of approximating a given signal. Now let me just sort of point out, as I did in a previous slide, that there are lots of different contexts in which you would want to do this. And in the context of, for example, data compression, if you have data and you want to represent it with a smaller number of parameters than just its values, then one of the ways you can do that is by modeling the data or modeling the signal and representing the signal in terms of a smaller data set than the raw values of the signal. And in fact, that's what's done probably in all of your cell phones. And in fact, the technique that we're talking about here is probably one of the principal methods that's embodied in the smartphone that you're using. So this is called an ARMA model. ARMA stands for autoregressive moving average. And that's terminology that goes back to the early days of time series analysis. And so the moving average part of it is the FIR part, which is the numerator. And the autoregressive is the IIR part. Autoregressive meaning that when you write that difference equation, the next value of the output depends on previous values of the output. That's why it's called autoregressive. Now, this problem in general is easy or hard depending on kind of how you think about it. And actually, an experience of mine a long time ago was talking to a very well-respected, very well-known colleague in the control systems area. And one of the questions he asked me is, what is an unsolved problem in signal processing? And I said, oh, well, ARMA modeling. I said the AR part of it, we know how to deal with. The moving average part of it, we don't know how to deal with. It's an unsolved problem. He got really excited, and he said, that's fantastic because we know how to do both of those in my community. And it took he and I quite a few hours of discussion before we finally understood that in his context, the problem is solved. In my context, the moving average part of this remains unsolved. And I don't want to go into the details of that, but it basically has to do with, and just reflect on this at some point, the difference between identification and modeling. Identification is where you say, I know that the signal fits that model. Now I just need to identify the parameters. Modeling is that I know to begin with that the signal does not fit that model, but I want to model it as best I can within the context of that model. So in the context of signal processing, determining the autoregressive part is what we're going to talk about. Determining the moving average part is, for the most part, still unresolved. And if you explain that to some people in some other communities, they're going to say, well, yeah, but we know how to do that. So when you're reflecting on that comment, think about the difference between modeling and identification.